Ladies and gentlemen, okay. Oh, now I'm turned on. Ooh, now it's turned on. We're going to, we're delighted to have you here today. And this is the Center for the Arts organization presenting these lunchtime lecture series. And our first one for this season is going to be Bob Jensen. But I've been handed a couple of announcements that people would like to have you know about, some other things that are going on. The Church Women United will be having their meeting Friday, the 7th of November at 9:30 a.m. at Silver Palm United Methodist Church. Now, Silver Palm United Methodist Church is not on Silver Palm. It's on Coconut Palm, that's right. The first time I tried to find that church, I went all up and down Silver Palm Drive until I just thought, well, I was crazy. But it's on Coconut Palm Drive, right across from Nouse Berry Farm. That's the easiest way to find it. Church Women United. If you want further information, you can call Marge at 305. Yes? Or see her. Or call Marge at 305-258-1010. Bring a friend. And bring items for a silent auction. And there's a neat flyer on that, if you're interested. Through God, our hands can heal. Another announcement, Yvonne's been handing these out, several of you have gotten them. Main Street Book Fair. This is going to be a book fair primarily of people from Homestead and around Homestead that have written books. We actually have several authors in our neighborhood, in within our community, and they're really, some of them are good. I've read several of Charlie's books. Charlie, raise your hand. Okay, oh, she moved. She's over there. Okay, several of Charlie's books, and of course Bob's book with Seth Bramson will be there, and others. The food trucks will be there. There'll be music along the way. It's at Losner Park, right downtown Homestead, outside, and it is. What's the time on that, Yvonne? 1 to 5 in the afternoon. This is when they're doing the children's. They're giving books to children. They give books to children. And that is Saturday, October 11th. That's just right around the corner. That's this Saturday. The Women's Club of Homestead is presenting the Carlacci Cohan Jewish-Italian Comedy Wedding. Now, if that doesn't intrigue you, I don't know what will. It's interactive. This group is a whole lot of fun. We've had them there before. And the performance includes a prime rib dinner, a real great dinner. And that is going to be November 8th, Saturday, November 8th at 6 o'clock at the Women's Club House. The Women's Club is also celebrating their 100th year this year, as is Florida City. Our speaker this morning is someone I know fairly well. I think I've known him for about 60 years. We're celebrating our 56th wedding anniversary. Bob grew up in a small town, and thank you, yes. Bob grew up in a small town in Iowa. We met at the University of Iowa, and then he joined the Navy. Since he was in the Navy, we traveled, and we have lived in all from Maryland to California, from the Philippines to Iceland, and a few other places in between. But when he was assigned to Homestead, we came here in 1978. He was assigned to Homestead Air Force Base at that time, and he stayed here on assignment for 4 years. We looked at each other, and we said, this is where we want to stay. So he retired from the Navy with 28 years, and we have been in Homestead ever since then. And I think he has dug in and found out and learned as much as he could about the Homestead, Florida City area as possible. And it has been his goal, his mission to and to get it down on paper so that it will be remembered for time eternal. So I would like to introduce you to someone that I know pretty well, and I think many of you do know him, Robert Bob Jensen.
Nancy, never give a microphone to a speech teacher. And by the way, I'll be married 57 years in December.
I said he had already been married 56.
That's not what you said. Remember, men never remember anniversaries, right? It's really a pleasure to be here talking about Florida City. I have a fondness in my heart for Florida City because of the Florida Pioneer Museum, and I've known, ever since we've lived here, I've known the commissioners and known the mayors, and so it's very special for me. This is the 100th anniversary. We'll be celebrating it in December. We're celebrating it all year long. Thank you to the South Dade News Leader. We're having articles almost on a weekly basis on the history of Florida City, and it's a rich, rich history. I need to apologize before I start. I have far more material than maybe you have patience for, but I'm going to try to go through some of it faster than others. Anybody here grow up in Florida City? Oh, congratulations. Wow. Anybody live in Florida City now? Area? Wow, more than that. Okay. I hope you learned something from this presentation today. Florida City was unlike Homestead. First of all, Homestead was settled long before Florida City, like 6 years. Homestead was a railroad town. Florida City was a developer town. And the differences were pretty dramatic. But in both cases, all the land in Homestead was owned by the Florida East Coast Railway. All the land in Florida City was owned by first the Tatum Brothers, and then secondly Miami Land and Development Company. They started off with 10,000 acres. A year later, they bought 16,000 more acres of land called the Cedars. I don't know where they got that name, but it was out toward the bay. They bought it from the Model Land Company, which was owned by FEC. And basically, all the land from the Florida East Coast Railroad tracks to the bay, and 5 miles north to south, 9 3/4 miles east to west. Yes?
I don't know what marl prairie is.
Marl is a type of soil. It's kind of like clay-like. It's not the greatest thing in the world for growing, but our farmers did very, very well with it. And that's in contrast to the soil on the other side of the FEC tracks west, which is all rock, mostly rockland, but there are some like marl pits or whatever you want to call them. This is the building that the the Miami Land Development Company built. It's going to look familiar because later on it was taken over by Edward Styling, who was a part of the company. He took the front porch off, used it for his real estate office, and then later it became a post office. The Miami Land and Development Company was a major, major company. At one time, they owned close to 30,000 acres. Edward Styling and Dr. Shields both had come from Detroit, were their agents, and like Edward Styling did more than just sell the property. He did a lot for the design. Here's a picture of Edward Styling. I talked to a woman who grew up across the street. She was a little Italian girl, and she said he was so stern that she hated to even walk on the other side of the street. They lived right across the street from Edward Styling because he was such a kind of a grouchy old man. And he was. He was a land salesman. He designed the town. He designed those wide streets. He became the postmaster, biggest landowner. When somebody was unhappy with their purchase, he bought it from them. He really believed in the project. He was the mayor twice. He was the second mayor, and then back in 38 and 40, he became mayor again. He was a town commissioner, president of our Chamber of Commerce, belonged to the Lions Club, and was a big person in St. John's Episcopal Church. Here's the building without the front porch. He sold real estate out of this building. Here's when it became a post office, same building. Here's some sad-looking ladies. These are the people who came, the first group of settlers who came from Detroit. They arrived by railroad. There wasn't even a railroad station there. All you got is like a siding or a platform there. See how those ladies are dressed? This is October, even though the picture says November. So they are probably wondering, how in the world did my husband ever talk me into this? I'm ready to take the next train back. And there weren't houses. There was no place for them to live. They lived in tents. They rented a room from other people in Homestead, and they stayed at the hotel in Homestead. So they were hardy souls. You can see there are a few children there, but it's mainly retirees. The first residents were really highly educated people, ministers, doctors, dentists, merchants, machinists, contractors. W.H. Hunter was the very first resident of Detroit, as it was called, before it became Florida City and Incorporated. And this was a contrast to Homestead. Homestead was settled mainly by people who had worked for the Florida East Coast Railway, extending it from Homestead down to the Keys in Florida and Key West. This is a postcard showing, really early postcard showing people standing out in a pine forest there. They're prospective buyers. This is another postcard. These are some guys just hanging out, I guess, on the beach around the coconut palms. This is the platform that was used to load and unload freight coming from the north. You can see those that look like bean hampers there. This guy on the left is really, really important. This last year, the museum purchased 12 or more photos, all from this man. He apparently had them taken, or he took them himself, mailed them to somebody in New York. They put them in the attic. Somebody died. They cleaned out the attic. They put them on the internet. And they were so expensive you cannot believe it. And I'll show you later why they were so expensive. But the guy on the left is the guy who sent the photos north. And this is, again, how he lived. He paid $3 a month rent to live with that other guy. Here he is out in the field. That looks like a bean field. You can see the pine trees in the background. Here's why the pictures were so expensive. There were two of them that had black families in them. And the collectors of black memorabilia are willing to pay almost any price. So these photos ended up costing us close to $300, and it was at an auction. So you can see how the price went up very quickly. And this is probably a house owned by the Miami Land and Development Company. Here's the earliest picture we have of the Florida City FEC station. You can see the platform here on the right. He marked that. And you can see that the depot was above the ground quite a bit because of the low-lying area. This shows you what housing looked like. It was scattered. It was very basic. Everybody had an outhouse. And George Grunwell and his daughter Karen Buckley spent a lot of time identifying these houses and the streets, and we're really indebted to him for that. Again, this is an early drainage canal dug by the Miami Land and Development Company. It was necessary. This house had the caption says, "The Dutchman's Home." Well, we finally figured out that's Andy Turberg. Andy was quite a character. He was Dutch. He sold real estate, but he was really known as the owner of Andy's Bar, which was really the only bar in Homestead and the only package store. And he did very well for himself. We'll see another building in here, a major building in Florida City that he owned. But Andy was a director of First National Bank of Homestead, and back then they put out a statement of condition every 6 months, and they did a little biography on each of the directors, and they'd say, farmer, whatever, whatever. And they got down to Andy, and they said, retail merchant. And anybody that knows anything about Jesse Robinson, Jesse was the first employee of First National Bank of Homestead. Jesse worked for Andy on Saturdays at the bar. At the back of the bar was where black people had to buy their packaged liquor. Well, Jesse knew more about whose check was good and whose check wasn't good from being at the bank, so Andy would run back and show Jesse a check, and Jesse would never say yes or no. He'd just go like this, say yes or no, and that's how Andy kept his losses down. Again, another one of these pictures. We can see the Hotel Detroit was the first hotel in town, and it had to have an outhouse, of course. But when the company brought down visitors, they generally put them up in the Hotel Detroit, and they stayed overnight. And they had meals there too. This is the town hall. It was built in 1911. It was a subscription type thing. They asked people to donate. They did, and they built it. And it was used for many, many purposes. Here it's used as a school. It was used, they bought a bell, and this bell was a big purchase and something that people in Detroit were really, really proud of. And here it is as a school. And the tall man, kind of right in the white section to the left of the door, is Reverend Cale. He was the first Methodist pastor down here. He started the church in Florida City, but he was really mainly known for causing Homestead to incorporate. He also owned a newspaper, the very first newspaper in Homestead. Unfortunately, he went bankrupt. His wife died at a very early age. He donated her books to the Women's Club of Homestead, and that was the first library in town. And then he moved away. I think he moved to Iowa, and he died of cancer. Back then, people didn't have automobiles, so if you were going to do something on Sunday, you got dressed up and you caught a ride with the Browns steam tractor here and went off to the beach or wherever you were going to go. This rock plow really changed everything because, to answer your question, all this land east of the US 1, the railroad tracks, could easily be plowed. The rock land could not be, so they just literally had to grind up the rock and then use it as a planting medium more than as soil. So this rock plow did that. Then later they put them on the front of bulldozers. The company had big plans for the 30,000 acres. What we now know as Florida City, they called Detroit. They planned a city halfway to the bay that was going to be called Detroit Central. And then they were going to develop the beach and call it Detroit Beach. Well, where's Yvonne? Yvonne keeps using the term Little Detroit. Not a good term, not a historic term, and they never called it. It's something that people come up with recently. So these are the three names that we know Florida City and Detroit by. Edward Styling really lived at the top of the chain here. He was a very good salesman. He was very frugal. You can see he has a windmill there. He used that to generate electricity, which was stored in batteries, and also to pump water. So, and you can see his homestead is very, very nice. And this is right in the middle of town. It's south of Palm Drive.
Any of these houses you're showing still exist?
None that we've seen so far are still in existence. This is again one of his buildings. This is probably like a cookhouse or a wash house. He knew how to make money. He canned tomatoes, and in 1914, this is just like 4 years after the first people came, he shipped 5 rail car loads of tomatoes out of here, and that's like 90,000 cans of tomatoes. And he wasn't satisfied with that. He bought a packing plant in Davie also. So he knew how to make money. And the safe that he kept it in is in the possession of the Florida Pioneer Museum. The last of his local relatives passed away just recently, Swede Gustus, who was married to his granddaughter. And the family donated the safe and some other documents and plat books to the museum. This is what the hotel looked like from the front. The hotel's on the left. On the right there is what's called the lunchroom. Only one place have we ever seen it listed as Rustad's. They just usually called it the lunchroom. Then the building over on the left, if you would see it, would be the bicycle shop owned by the first chair of the City Commission, M.L. Williams. He was also the Justice of the Peace, so he was called Judge Williams. And here he is. He was the Justice of the Peace for the 8th District, First Commission Chair. He owned the bicycle shop, and he was also the notary public. When he left, there was never any word in the newspaper of why he left. And this was pretty typical of departure of families. Here's the other side of the street. This is almost like the first shopping center in South Florida. Cormac was kind of like a general store there. And it was owned by a Methodist pastor also, Reverend Cormac. The next building, it was a furniture store. It was owned by a Jewish family from Key West. And then next to that is a pharmacy or drugstore. That's on Palm Drive, right. What's really interesting was the Jewish family, it's on, yeah, George said the north side, loaned the use of their furniture store on Sunday to the First Catholic Church. So the First Catholic Church in South Florida met in the furniture store. And that's not that unusual because right now we have a Protestant congregation meeting in the Jewish Center. So it's kind of like an old tradition around here. The W.C. Norwood store and post office, you can see the post office boxes there on the left. It was down toward the railroad tracks. And I think his wife ran the store most of the time. And she was the postmistress. This is the Florida East Coast Railway Station and the post office. This billboard, it's kind of hard to see read it. I don't know whether they painted over it or what, but it was on the railroad tracks so they could advertise the city. And this is after the city was incorporated. South side of Palm Drive, you can see the two-story building with the porch on the first front, kind of in the middle there is the bicycle shop, and then the hotel, and then the lunchroom. Water was important for two reasons in first Detroit and then Florida City. The first was to drain the land so that it would be usable, and the second was as a means of transportation out to the bay, and then further to Miami, where goods were usually transshipped then up to like Philadelphia and New York. And the dredges were steam driven, and you can see a pile of wood there. They used anything available that they could burn to use for fuel. This is an early steam tractor. This one belonged to Miami-Dade County. You can see the roller on the front helped to break up the rock. This is the Florida City Canal, which is much narrower now. You can see some of those boats are really, really nice. I can't remember which one, but A.C. Graw, who later bought the newspaper here, came down from, he was a wealthy printer in Philadelphia, and he came down here in his own yacht. I can't remember what's the first or the second one. Lived on it, and then decided to buy the local newspaper and stayed. And then his son took over the paper. Again, the Detroit Canal, you can see the number of boats here, how important it was as a means of transport. The industrial basin or the terminal basin was pretty much where Chroma Avenue, from I say Chroma Avenue out to the railroad tracks. And the purpose was to have a place where businesses could be set up like an ice company, like packing houses, and then they could ship out either by water or by rail, or in by water or in by rail. In 1915, Florida City entered the industrial parade in Miami, and you can see the blocks of, those are blocks of ice, and they have beautiful tropical fruit and flowers in them. And they won, first prize. Ruby Hunt was the float queen. We had a District 8 band, and I think there may be even somebody in the crowd here whose ancestors played in that band. It had just been formed 90 days earlier, but they were in the parade, and the trophy that they won is about this tall, silver trophy, and it's at the Florida Pioneer Museum. So come down to the museum and take a look at it. There was a pavilion also on the canal, which was used for entertainment, dancing, parties on the top story, and swimming at the bottom. You can see here there's a boat and the swimmers, and then you can see the open area up above. But this was really very popular for entertainment.
When did they fill that canal in?
The canal kind of filled in by itself, but I don't know when the industrial basin was filled. It's one of those things never mentioned in the newspapers. Again, swimmers, you notice the swimming suits? A little different from those of today. And this just shows you how many people were there when the photo was taken. People on top, on the bridge, everywhere.
Bob,
Yes?
was that on the corner of Crone and Pond Drive?
It was about there, yeah. Yeah. Again, the canal was used for boating. You can see folks here. The Ring family was only in Florida City for a short time. They had a very nice boat, a very nice family, and some of their descendants sent us postcards and pictures, which was a great contribution to the history of Detroit and Florida City. We didn't have Native Americans or Indians living here, but they did come to trade, and this is a photo of a couple on the canal. Some of them did come to work, mainly loading produce onto trains. This house was a beautiful home. It's kind of, if you were to look, be at the Burger King in Florida City and look northwest, this is about where it was. But this family came from California. They visited and then they decided to stay here, and they ran a nursery until Mr. Becker died in 1930, and the house stood until probably 1980. The company, Miami Land and Development Company, was big into recreation as a means of attracting people down. They built this cottage out on the bay, where the bay and the canal intersected, and it was available for use for, you could rent boats, you could rent swimming suits, you could rent fishing gear, and it was a very popular spot. But people then were pretty much like people are today. The reason it didn't last very long is because when they needed to build a fire, they'd tear a piece of the building off. So it was one of those things that the organizers thought it would work out better than it really did.
Would that be where Turkey Point is?
Yeah, the canal that runs out from Florida City, the north side of that. Here's the dredge at work. This is a postcard that the Miami Land and Development Company put out to encourage people to come. And the other side, you see it says, write and get a copy of our free book and our newspaper. They did publish a newspaper. I think we've got 1 or 2 issues of it. It's full of information about people, so really important for documenting our history. This one was obviously taken to sell people on coming down, except the lady on the right there seems to have a mosquito net over her head. The boy with the fishing pole, this really looks like it's a posed picture. Again, this was a postcard or a photo taken when the first church was under construction. I believe that was the Methodist church. Incorporation, 1914. Why did they decide to incorporate? Because things were going very well. The big major threat was Homestead wants to annex us and make us part of their community, and we don't want that. In October, they had a meeting to discuss incorporation, but the voters got there late, so they could not vote to do it then. So on December 28th, at the town hall where you saw the picture that was a school in the church, they met. The attorney for Schutz and Bowen, and this is a law firm still in existence, were there and represented the incorporators, and they decided to incorporate and change the name. Dr. Forrest, who was a medical doctor, was elected mayor. Judge M.L. Williams, who we talked about the bicycle shop, was elected head of the county commission, or the city commission. We had 2 doctor brothers, the Shields, who were elected alderman, and C.S. Ho was elected marshal. Florence Shield, I can't remember which doctor she was married to, is said to have come up with the name Florida City. Well, women couldn't vote back then. They weren't probably even not allowed to come to the meeting. Well, how in the world did she decide the name was going to change from Detroit to Florida City? Ladies, you know how she did it. She wrote down a piece of paper. It said, please rename the city Florida City, put it in her husband's pocket. He went to the meeting, he pulled it out, and lo and behold, they decided, you know, in all of Florida, there isn't a Florida City. This is the name we need to stick with. Well, not everybody liked that. Edward Styling decided he really didn't like it, and so he sued, and the case went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court, and he lost. So the name Florida City stuck. But there was a period of time when people didn't change it because they didn't know whether he was going to win or lose. Land clearing was always a big project down here. And you can see this machine, which we don't really understand completely, was probably used just for that. It looks like a Rube Goldberg. You know, it's got one wheel on the back, and it's got tracks for the two other wheels. This is what the first school in Florida City looked like. Beautiful, beautiful building. Very practical. You see the eaves overhang for shade. The windows are large and open up to catch the breeze. The first hospital south of Miami was actually in Florida City. This is a bad picture. This is Mrs. Hunt. She was a nurse. She established the first hotel or hospital, and that's what it looked like. You're going to see a better picture of it later. This two-story building just north and east of City Hall. She kind of had a tragic life. Her husband was, I guess, thought to be kind of a no good. He drank too much. He didn't hold jobs. So she had to kind of struggle to keep the hospital going. She actually moved it to a different building, to a new building that was built for her in Homestead. And that other building was built as a home and used as a hospital. This was built as a hospital with an operating room. And Dr. Tower, who was a doctor who lived southwest of Florida City and then in Homestead, encouraged her to come and probably gave her the lot to build on. Little humor here. Florida City owned a mule in 1917, which they sold for $106, which is the equivalent of $1,827.59 today. You might ask, what was that mule used for? It was probably used to by the person called the scavenger, who was never identified for obvious reasons. This is you know, we couldn't have outhouses the way we do, where you can dig a hole in the ground. And so they had pails underneath the seats in the outhouses. And the scavenger came around once or twice a week, pulled them out, dumped them into like a tank truck, probably pulled by a mule, took them out in the country and just dumped it on top of the ground. And you had to pay for that service, of course. And we have the first, a copy of the first ordinances in Florida City, so we know exactly what they had to pay. And it wasn't inexpensive. But never, never did either city ever identify their scavenger, and both of them had scavengers. In 1919, also, the first tourists came to Florida City. They camped right next to Edward Styling's office, which had been the Miami Land and Development Company office. They were called tin can tourists back then because they ate out of tin cans, and sometimes they left them behind. In 1924, this became established at the same location as a formal campground, and the city of Florida City has one now. Famous people who came to visit Florida City were Dr. Kellogg, like Kellogg's Rice Krispies, from Michigan. He was big into health and came down and checked out tropical fruits like the papaya. Carl Fisher, Prestolite fame, really is the father of Miami Beach. Prestolite was a means of lighting headlights in automobiles. William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president and lost, and who became Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, came and visited. He actually had a winter home in Miami. He and his wife and daughter came. His daughter later became the first elected congresswoman from Florida. And of course, Miami bank presidents came to check their investments because the borrowers were big-time borrowers down here. 1920 to 1930, plans were made to reroute the highway from Miami via Old Cutler, and they did. They saved 3 miles. The population of Florida City was only 355 in 1920. It went to 452 in 1930. This picture, unfortunately, the printer printed backwards, so I'm going to skip over it. This is what Palm Drive looked like in the 1920s. Those trees were beautiful, and they came from the Women's Clubs of Florida, raised them. They're Royal Palms at the Royal Palm State Park, and they raised these plants, trees, and others as a means of supporting the clubhouse, which was at the state park that they established. It was the first state park in the state of Florida, and it was owned by the Women's Clubs of Florida. The palms were taken out by DOT. And we all know they like to take out palm trees, even today. In 1922, there was still a land boom on in Florida, and so the owners of then Florida City arranged for a land auction. There were 7 large buses, 57 cars, 30,000 people came to the auction. They sold 137 parcels at $30 to $100 an acre, so it was a successful sale. Card Sound Road, 1924, Dade County built it, and back then the construction all was not supervised by professional staff but by elected officials. J.D. Redd was our commissioner, and he did the supervising. This is dredge that was used to build Card Sound Road. You can see it's got like wooden paddle treads, but it got the job done. Florida City really did well when it came to parades. This is the very first Fruit Festival parade ever, 1924. Florida City had 2 units. The first one's, the caption read, "From winter's cold and snow." The second one here on the right was "To Florida City and Sunshine." That auto tourist camp was established formally in 1924, right beside what was then Edward Styling's office. Before the highway was built beginning in 1935 from Florida City to Key West, people had to go by a series of ferries and bridges, and this seems a strange thing to be called a ferry because it's really a barge being towed here, but it went from Florida City Road, which was I guess the Card Sound Road, to Key Largo. Get another view of it here. Rockgate, Ed Leeds Calvin came from California in 1923. He built his first coral castle, if you will, but it was called Rockgate, southwest of Florida City. I don't know the exact location. I've been there, but I don't think you can probably get back there. It's on private property. It is. 352 Street. So maybe get the owner's permission. But a lot of it's still there. He didn't haul it all away. And then he moved it from there to property on US 1. Here's Ed in Florida City, and you can see a lot of the things that he carved cut out of the rock. He moved almost everything. Ed liked to dress up. This is a piece of equipment that he used to move the stone. Again, all these things you'll see at the present location. And this is how it looked from the outside. Anybody know Genevieve Van Byers? Anyway, this is her as a child at Rockgate. Waldo Geronimo was the brother of very famous William Geronimo. And you can see here he's brought a gator back to town. The 1926 hurricane was a very wet one. The Gladiola apartments were on the close to Palm Drive, but on the highway. What avenue was that? 3rd Avenue. US 1 used to run along 3rd Avenue before it went to Chrome Avenue, and it went right by here. There were several businesses in this building and apartments up above. You can see it took some pretty strong damage here. The drugstore was owned by Dr. Crow, but you couldn't buy prescription drugs there because they didn't have a pharmacist. But I'm sure they sent them down. There was a real estate office there, and it was probably one of the better buildings in Florida City at the time. In 1926, they built a new jail, but not early enough because they had 9 jailbreaks before they got around to building the jail. And they had only 136 qualified voters at the time. Here is again a dredge. May have been used by Miami Land and Development Company to dig the canal out to the bay. William Geronimo, really important in the history of Florida City. He was an Army officer in World War I. When the war came to an end, he mustered out. He was appointed the interim town marshal in 1929 because the marshal was back in his hometown of Detroit. He was elected in 1930 to the town commission, became the marshal in 1931 and was there until 1950. It was an elected position then. He became mayor for 4 years. He was really proud of his Army service and was like a stalwart of the American Legion. He was always the adjutant. And the adjutant was kind of the person that kept everything together, did all the administrative stuff. But also, in Florida at the time, American Legion posts sold license plates as a means of generating income. There he is. He was seldom seen without his hat because he was bald. His daughter is Charlotte Geronimo Schmunk. Very important Florida Pioneer Museum, Homestead Hospital, American Red Cross. In 1930, the population was 452. Then 10 years later, it had grown by 66% to 752. But you can see, of the 752, only 221 were qualified voters. Flora Myers was a long-time town clerk. She had her office in her home, and she was paid $40 a month. Women were very strong in Florida City. They had another postmistress and a chapman, and she'd served by this time 13 years. Mayor B.H. Edwards came as, again, an agent for the Miami Land and Development Company. He became mayor 2 years after he arrived and served until 1934. His daughter, Jackie, and her husband, Henry Brooker, were very important in our community for many, many ways. They were stalwarts of the Pioneer Museum. They were really strong in the St. John's Episcopal Church. They were some of the most generous people I have ever met. They lived very humbly and just gave so much to everybody. After they passed away, a local florist told me that they had a massive flower bill every month because anytime anybody had a sick child or somebody lost a family member, the Brookers sent flowers. And again, one of my fondest memories was at the end of their lives, we were having a meeting at the Pioneer Museum, and we couldn't find Henry. He was out picking wildflowers for Jackie. And I thought this was so symbolic because he didn't buy flowers for Jackie. He bought flowers for everybody else, but he picked wildflowers for Jackie. And I was a pallbearer at both their funerals, and Jackie, the very first hymn sung at Jackie's funeral was "Jesus Loves Me," which went back to her childhood. James Sotilli was very important in the history of Florida City. He was a millionaire. He bought the outstanding mortgages on all the land that Miami Land and Development Company had. And he incorporated something called South Dade Farms in 1934, which was like an umbrella organization for everything he did. He was a very, very generous man. People at the time probably didn't think so, but this is what he did. We would not have a state farmers market in Florida City if he hadn't given the land. It was on the railroad tracks, so it was very expensive. The South Dade Labor Camp out by the base, he donated 80 acres for that. And something everybody has, I'm sure, forgotten is he gave 1,200 acres for Bayfront Park. So all these things probably would never have happened without his generosity. And I mean, you just think about the amount of miles of roads he built, the canals he dug, and he really changed the face of agriculture down here. He used a system that he said was like one was used in Italy to lease land to farmers, and most of them were Italians. Most of them came from New York and from New Jersey. And he divided this land up and leased it out. And he also built the South Dade Farmers Bank. Someone up here was wondering why we didn't have a picture of it here in the Pioneer Room. And it was one of 9 banks that he owned. He owned ranches up in northern Florida. If you travel on the turnpike, you'll cross a bridge called Sotillia Creek or Sotillia Bridge. More Coral Castle. We'll go over these quickly. This is a Geronimo Rothenburg home. Geronimos and Rothenbergs were like in-laws. Rothenberg was a doctor in Massachusetts, I believe, a dentist. And his son was killed in World War II, and one of those boys is his son. This is what Palm Drive looked like in the 1930s. See, the trees have grown there some. Again, Chamber of Commerce. This is a Chamber of Commerce visit to Coral Castle. President Roosevelt came in 1939, and one of our late board members from the Pioneer Museum, Orville Irwin, was there and saw the presidential car and all. And Orville said that all along the route, which was US 1, he said he saw all these guys up on the telephone poles, and he wondered, what's the telephone company out doing work today for? They were actually Secret Service people. And the president, came by train, and at this time the road was not constructed to Key West, so he went to Key West. Well, he actually did go to Key West by train. He arrived here by train, and he drove down. And one question he asked was, how are the crops? And this was the second presidential visit. The first one, William Howard Taft came by train in 1913 for the exact same reason. He was going to catch a ship in Key West down to the canal. 1940, the population was 752. It soared then like twice by 1950. This is a real estate office owned by Eleanor Froscher. She was one of the first women involved in real estate, and she was actually a part of the real estate board. The pipeline to Key West was built in the early 1940s. The pipes and all were marshaled in Homestead. They were coated with, of all things, asbestos, and then shipped down and installed. And again, Orville Irwin was a part of this. This is the Last Chance, but in its earliest version. They sold sandwiches, soft drinks, beer. Here's Charlotte Geronimo, a beautiful young lady, and I think her friend there is one of the, pardon me? Teresi girls, yeah. And the post office is behind there, and the Teresi's hotel, the Palms Hotel, is on the right there. It was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Joe Teresi. Charlotte was the majorette. She was very photogenic, so her picture was in the paper a lot. And again, big hospital volunteer, American Red Cross volunteer. She married Rick Schmunk, who was in the Army in World War II. After the war, he became the city clerk in Florida City, And then they kind of morphed it into something that was like a city manager. I'm not sure they ever did it legally, but some photos identify him as the city manager. Bill Myers Filling Station in Florida City, and later we'll hear about that name. This is what his window looked like, very 3-cent Coca-Colas, cigars, candy. 1945 hurricane, this is what South Chrome looked like. In 1947, the dedication of Everglades National Park actually took place in Everglades City, not Homestead, where the headquarters for the park was. Why? Because the people in Collier County had a lot more influence with the party in the Democratic Party than we did over here. So what they did was they had the dedication over there. President Truman came down, but they did the stamp, Everglades National Park stamp from here, and it actually brought in a lot of people and brought a lot of attention to the city. Here's the dedication. You can see that's Florida City City Hall in the background. We had senators here. We had one of the third assistant postmasters. This is what it looked like at the post office as they were canceling the stamps. Here's the post office. It used to be Edward Styling's office, and before that, the Miami Land and Development office. First day covers were like collector's items, and so everybody wanted to have something mailed from Florida City on December 6th or 5th and have it canceled. And the museum has an extensive collection of these first day covers. We don't know of any that exist that we don't have. Just about $800,000 worth of stamps were sold in Florida City. Can you imagine that? How many, they were hand stamped. Can you imagine how many that would be? Because I think they were 3-cent stamps at that time. Again, the Florida City School. This is what it looked like in the 40s. You can see what it looked like in 1916. Beautiful structure. 1946, the town hall was remodeled and a vault was there until Hurricane Andrew. The town hall was basically built around that old town hall, school, church that we saw from 1911. In fact, I got a chance to kind of crawl around the attic and see, it was just a building inside of a building. They did a $75,000 bond issue for a water system. Believe it or not, the Grand Ole Opry's Bill Monroe came to the Homestead, Florida City, and Florida City's budget was just short of $15,000 a year. The population was 1,006, and Herbert Hunter, the mayor, was really proud that there was no debt. And Anna Chapman was still the postmistress. Cardsound Bridge. This was a swing bridge. It was built in 1947. This is somebody we need to really remember. Somebody who has been totally forgotten is Mabel Robertson Mears. She was the daughter of W.F.A. Robertson, who lived in Florida City. She was a nurse during World War II. She escaped the Japanese, and just like in the movie, she signaled a U.S. submarine which took her to Australia, and she came back with General MacArthur. And a week after she came back, people probably forgot her, which is sad. Florida City Fire Department. After the guys came back and the gals came back from World War II, they formed a Kiwanis Club in Florida City. One of their first jobs was to create a fire department. They bought a 6-wheel fire truck that had been converted from a military truck in Clewiston and added on 2 bays to the city hall and had a fire department. And this is what the guys looked like. The one that you'll all recognize is front row left, Steve Teresi. We know the names of the others, but I don't have them right at the tip of my tongue. This is the leaders of Florida City about this time. You can see the man in the police uniform is Willie Fasulo. One next to him is Rick Schmuck, to the right, Rick Schmuck, the city manager, city clerk, and then Frank Navilio, who was the mayor at that time. But we know, I think we've identified all of them. Again, population, went from almost 16,000 to over 4,000 in 10 years, so a big jump. This trading post was on the corner of Lucy and Chrome on the south side, and it was identified on this postcard and probably by the owners as being in Homestead when it was actually Florida City. The building is no longer there. It was a package store, probably the only one in Florida City. There was just one in Homestead. This lady is amazing. Her name is Regina Liberty. Her first husband's name was Basso. Her son's name was Frank Basso. She was married like 4 times. Her husband Basso was unfaithful to her, and so she left him, and they lived in Michigan. She went to California, picked fruit, packed fruit with this little boy in tow, met a man out there, married, came to Miami by bus, came to Florida City because he knew somebody in Florida City, and this is where she ended up living. This is the house that was the hospital, and if you look closely, there's a Volkswagen bus here, and that was her whole personality. She was a tiny little lady. She was a Italian-American widow. And so she would gather up all the Italian-American widows and take them to church. She'd go get them, and they have like a Vesper service at her house. She'd take them out to dinner. And her son said that VW bus had one speed, 30 miles an hour, on the straightaway, around corners. And he said, as they turned a corner, you know, they had plastic seats. These little ladies would all slide to this side, and then she'd come back over this side. And she converted her living room into a chapel. And you can see I think that's a figure of Christ in her front yard there. But an amazing lady. And her husband, or her son, turned out to be a multimillionaire farmer, starting from nothing. There he is. He looks like a movie star. The guy on the left on the top, guy on the left there, Frank Basso. Pardon me? The house is still standing, yeah.
Is that the one that Edwin Skellen built the wall around?
No. Somebody else built that wall. It was, I think, well, the one that paid for it was Andy Turberg. But Ed did not have anything to do with that wall. Here's again, tomatoes used to be sold at auction. So they'd, like on a Friday, they would pick tomatoes, bring them in. And if you were at the end of the line, you might not have your tomatoes bid on until like 10 o'clock at night. Well, Frank is the guy right there in the middle, kind of peering into the box. And this was a primary way of selling produce. So you could either do very well or not do very well. Frank, like a lot of farmers, made money, decided he'd be an expert in everything. So he bought a Lincoln Mercury dealership and failed. It was downtown Homestead. Trying to think, I think the antique mall is where, yeah. And here's Frank on the left with some well-known Homestead people with a beautiful automobile. Sam Nicotra was one of the Italian farmers who came down because of the Satilles. Actually, it was right after World War II, 1945. An elderly man in the town where he lived, the area where he lived, just didn't think he could drive to Florida City again. So Sam had an old Plymouth coupe, bald tires, used a lot of oil. So he agreed to drive this guy down. Well, he had to buy oil in a gallon can and stop about every 100 miles and refill it. And he got down here, and he partnered with another guy, and they actually raised like 3.5 acres of tomatoes behind that Bill Myers gas station. They rented a mule. To rent a mule was $1 a day, 50 cents for half a day, so they rented them by the half day. And they just really kind of broke even, so he didn't have any way of getting back to New York. So he was digging a foundation for a home, and you can imagine what it's like in the rock here. And a friend came by and said, let's go to the racetrack. He figured he had nothing to lose, so he went with his friend to the racetrack. He probably had like $5 in his pocket. But make a long story short, He followed his friend's advice, won some money, big money by then, by those standards, came back, loaded his car up, bought new tires, and drove back to New York. He came back later, and he and his brother, John, decided that they would kind of expand from agriculture into motels. So they built the motel on US 1. I'm trying to think of the name of it now. It's the one that's almost surrounded by Walmart. No, it has something to do with the bay. But anyway, they built a beautiful motel. They operated it. They got robbed a lot, so they got the dog. And after that, they didn't get robbed very much. But they were very wise. They bought land along US 1 around their motel and later sold it for other businesses. And I interviewed Sam earlier this year. This is the Porco family. The boys, there were actually 4 sons. One was born after they got down here. Mrs. Porco was a hospital dietitian in Pennsylvania. Her husband was a police officer, and they came down for health purposes. They ran a grocery store, and I'll show you the picture of it. On the first floor of this 2-story building. They lived on the 2nd floor, and it just happened that Sam Nicotra also rented a room on that 2nd floor. But they worked very hard. It was a small grocery, and later on, the husband, Samuel, went into farming, but farmed on a small scale. And he believes that he was the first one to do like double rows to get more use out of the land. But what they really accomplished is amazing. One son became a high school teacher, science teacher, and then went off and became a dentist. The second one became an optometrist. Third one became an optician, and the fourth one was a senior Air Force officer who was involved in Homeland Security type issues and is now doing the same thing as a civilian. So 4 out of 4 sons really did some great things with their lives. This is what the town hall looked like after they added the 2 bays for the fire department. Remember, on the right-hand side, the old town hall is right in there. This is Arthur Vining Davis Park, a Jack Levy picture. This is another postcard Jack did in the 50s, beautiful. Palm Drive, 1952. The Teresi home, which I think is still standing. The population had gone from about 4,000 just over 5,000 in 10 years. Jack Levy did just incredible work. He did a lot of aerial photos, and this is one that shows Palm Drive in 1963. Sue and R.S. Shiver. R.S. Shiver came to Homestead in 1949 as a 17-year-old, worked in agriculture for 2 years. Came from Georgia. In fact, he came from Dublin, Georgia. Mita, we stayed there earlier this year. It's a very small town. It's gotten very old and kind of depressed. He came in 1949. 2 years later, he went to work for W.C. Bass. They made windows. And actually, I didn't realize it, but they employed as many as 90 people in Homestead at that time. They manufactured windows for all over the Caribbean. They sent them by the boatload almost. 10 years after he went to work for them, he became the supervisor. In 1964, he ran for office as a Florida City Commissioner. And one of the first things he did was go to one of the senior Italian men in Florida City and ask for his support. Well, this fellow, Strano, had like 3 or 4 friends over. They were playing dominoes, and so that RS had to ask for his support in front of these other people. Well, Mr. Strano said, you know, RS, you're not Italian, and this is an Italian town, meaning I'm not going to support you. But one of the other men said to him, I'm going to support you. He said, you seem like you tell us the truth. And so he was elected in 1964. Every election since then, served 50 years, 48 of those years as police commissioner, And you can see here in the picture, he's turning over a police car to our well-known Willie Fasulo. Here's R.S. and his wife, Sue, recently with Commissioner Barbara Jordan. Florida City Speedway was a popular destination in the late 1960s, early 1970s. It's where the flea market ended up. It was a fairly sophisticated facility. A lot of the work was donated. You can see what the stands look like. Here's Brian Ingram with his family racing team. The midgets ran there. And a death in 1969 really caused the Speedway to be closed down. It was Gary Smith who was killed. Capri Restaurants are, again, a stalwart in Florida City for all these years. Started off as a pizza place. Dick Accurcio started off working in restaurants in Boston, and this was his first effort down here. The first family of Florida City is the Wallace family. That's Mayor Otis Wallace, Greer, and Ashley and Wesley. It's an older picture. Here's the real hero of the family. This is Mabel Beatles. This is Otis's grandmother. She came to the United States from the Bahamas in 1910 to Key West, and then she came up to Homestead and then moved to Florida City. She met a man from Live Oak. His name was Van Beatles, a really good man. She married him, and they had a family. Hard-working people. She worked in a tomato packing plant. If you know where Brooker Lumber used to be, it was right across the street there, 2nd Avenue. And her husband worked for the city of Coral Gables during that's Monday through Friday. On the weekends, he worked for the Police Benevolent Association, reloading ammunition in Coral Gables. And he drove back and forth every day and shared rides with other men from down here that worked for Coral Gables. This is Otis's beautiful mother. She was born Hattie Beatles. She married his father. They had Otis's father, Otis T. Wallace Sr. They had 4 children. Otis was the 4th. They separated, dissolved their marriage, and she married a wonderful man by the name of Isaiah Marshall. And they had 3 more children together, all daughters. So it was 3 sisters, Otis, 3 sisters. So you can guess Otis was pretty spoiled. This is a picture. You probably can't see it very well, but the one on the right, Otis is in. He's wearing cowboy boots. Those were his pride and joy. And his aunt, who's down here on the bottom left, is the one that bought them for him. Her name was Maud, and she just passed away recently. This is Otis again with mother, Aunt Maud, and sisters. And he's got those cowboy boots on. This is a picture of Otis's mom, Hattie Marshall, and her daughter, Commissioner Barbara Jordan, who's a tremendous success story in her own right. She went to the university in Georgia, came back, went to work as an intern for Miami-Dade County, worked her way up to assistant county manager, retired, ran for office, and is now a county commissioner. Aerojet was one of our projects we were going to get rich on. It was southwest of Florida City. It was solid fuel rockets for the space program. We decided later to go with liquid fueled rockets, and so the plant shut down and never really amounted to much. But you can see they spent a lot of money. It was a major facility. When what they did was they tested the engines by, I guess, pointing them down, if you will, and lighting them off. And the soot was so bad that it destroyed some of the groves around here. So it was not too popular. But it provided a lot of employment at high salaries. Here's one that's been fired, I guess. More Aerojet. This is one actually being fired. Jack Levy's up in an airplane and took this picture. You can see how much soot there is. Pioneer Museum was moved to Florida City in 1966. It was the Florida East Coast Railway Station in Homestead. It was moved because the city of Homestead wouldn't give the museum board any place in the city to relocate it. And the Brookers, Jackie and Henry, donated a lot that her father, B.H. Edwards, had owned, and the museum was moved there. The Teresi brothers moved this old caboose down, came by railroad and then with a trailer and a tractor, or a Caterpillar here. It was restored several times. Vandals constantly broke into it, lived in it, destroyed it, so we had to donate it to the Florida East Coast Railway Museum. 1970, the population was just over 5,000, went just over 6,000 in the next 10 years. Here's Willie Fasulo on the left, the last elected police chief in the state of Florida. There he is in his office. R.S. Shiver told me that Willie would be really tough. He'd arrest people, and then he would go to the judge and beg the judge not to punish him. But he kept arresting him. But he was really an interesting man. He owned the snack bar at the farmer's market, which was at the back of the market. Mayor Herman Lucerne. Herman is Italian. Came down here without much. I think he opened up a fruit stand on Chrome and then ended up being one of the larger fruit producers. Here are some of the characters. These are really characters. Okay, this is Ide Neff. That's hair everywhere. Ide was here during the wintertime when the circus wasn't in operation because he was a circus performer. I guess he was called the Wild Man from Missouri, he was never from Missouri, but I guess that was what sold. But anyway, he lived a kind of a lonely life, came here in the wintertime. His life was ended down here when he got sick and had to go off to the hospital and didn't come back. Pardon me?
12-foot beard.
George says his beard was 12 foot. And Irene and Lloyd Shanklin, I'm not so sure they'd be considered strange people in this day and age. They had a grove on Palm Drive, and they were really into health food. They had a health food laboratory. They gave lectures. Everybody thought they were eccentric, and I guess he had a problem with the law. He pulled a pistol on somebody, and that really kind of spelled the end of their time here. But to show you how things were, I have a friend whose parents came here in the 1950s, and the father was a professional cartoonist. The mother was an artist, a clay artist. Well, when they came to Florida City, they were labeled as communists because, I mean, anybody that, makes a living doing cartoons and artwork, and I guess they never really overcame that label, but times were different. So you can see how the Shanklins were seen. And again, she was a beautiful lady. She dressed exotically. He was very handsome, and he dressed in white suits. And again, their place was right on the south east corner of Palm Drive and Redland Road. Anthony Geronimo, that's the end. And I have more time if you have more time. So if anybody has any questions other than George, I'd be glad to answer. Thank you for coming. And again, we're really proud to be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the city of Florida City, and we hope that you'll be following leader. And when things happen in Florida City to commemorate the 100th anniversary, you'll be there. It's a great city. They're doing wonderful things. It's very solvent. The city leaders in Florida City are very financially conservative, the kind we like.
What's the current
Yes.
population? The last one you had up here was about 1980. What's the current number?
Where is Commissioner Brown? Commissioner Brown. Commissioner Brown, what is the current population of Florida City?
Good question. Approximately
Roughly
17,000.
17,000, yeah. And Homestead would be like 63,000. Any other questions? Anyway, I'll be around. If you have any questions later, I'd be happy to try to answer them. And come out for the book fair. George is going to be there, and he'll have several of his books. He has a book on the Seaboard Railways, one on the post offices that hit this area. Come out and see George. Well, I finished earlier than normal. Yeah. Sure.
We were invited here by maybe Commissioner Jordan. We're from the Theater South Atlanta.
Oh, wow.
We're doing a production